Welcome to this week's video. This week we're going to talk more about stepping out of the cycle and how to use the Arbinger Institute's book, The Anatomy of Peace, as a guide to help us step outside of the cycles that we're in and to increase our attachments. I'm Troy Faddis, Clinical Director of Legacy Outdoor Ventures.
And I'm Dr. Maddy Liebing. I'm the Clinical Director for Juniper Canyon Recovery Center for Women.
We're working on how to step out of the cycle and being able to first see that we're in it. And I know the last couple of weeks we've been helping everyone sort of recognize when they're in those stuck places. So the last couple of web classes we've been talking about noticing the cycle, and I hope that you've all been able to notice at least one and be able to give it a name and have that name be something that is powerful enough for you to both say, hey, we're in that again. I remember last time we talked about one of my clients who named the cycle after their grandfather. And it was powerful enough because they knew they were acting in that reactive way like their grandfather did, but it wasn't so personal or unresolved that they were triggered by calling it by their grandfather's name. And so being able to see the cycle can really help one recognize that we are being reactive and then start to explore what the deeper feelings may be of why we're reacting and those unmet needs that we're trying to accomplish by reacting that way.
Yeah, it's interesting that whenever you recognize that you're in the cycle, you're already starting to step out of the cycle. It's the awareness of the cycle that helps you to step out. And being able to tell that you're there and make a decision about stepping out. It's easier said than done, though, because sometimes you get really invested in that cycle. You get invested in that anger or frustration or whatever it is that's keeping you in that cycle. And so it's the intentional understanding and awareness helps, but it doesn't necessarily make it a done deal to step out. So we've got a few other things that will help us to be able to step out. So the next one on the list, and I'm just going to point out that the first thing on our list here, we're going to be talking about it a little bit later when we talk more about the anatomy of peace. So that's why we skipped over that. So now I'm talking about the advocating for your personal needs and being vulnerable. Obviously, when you're getting down into those primary emotions, when you're getting into those vulnerable emotions, it's risky and scary and hard to do sometimes. And one of the things we do a lot at Legacy is teach how to do I feel statements, where you're taking responsibility for your emotion and then sharing it with another person and taking responsibility for where you're responsible for those emotions. But also at the same time, implicit in that is an ask that they will hear your emotion and perhaps operate in a little bit different way. But what this is called in EFT is called reach, or reaching out and taking a risk. And it's kind of hard to do. And you have to recognize that it can be met with a rejection, and you have to be willing to do it anyway, even though you might not get the response that you want. But it's one of the ways to begin to step out of the cycle that helps to move the whole understanding between the two of you deeper into this process of understanding those vulnerable emotions and those unmet needs that can be shared, and that there can be an ask to help some of those needs to be met by the person that you're having, which you're in the cycle with, whoever you're having a relationship with, whether it's your son or daughter, or whether it's your partner, or whether it's your friend. And sometimes what we have to do is, if it feels like it's too big of a reach, then we have to cut it back a little bit, slice it a little bit thinner. And maybe what we say is, I just feel really vulnerable now, and I have some emotions that I'm a little bit afraid to share with you, instead of actually stating what the emotion is. But it makes it possible for you to be able to get to some of those things, and in that process to begin to break that cycle.
I like what you said about being vulnerable, being invested. That sometimes the more invested we are, whether it's invested in the cycle being a solution, or invested in justifying the ways we've been in the cycle in the past, we can be aware of it, but it makes it that much harder to step out of. And so we have to slice it thinner and be able to take that one chunk, just saying, right now I have a lot of feelings. I'm afraid to share them with you. Like you said, slicing it thinner. I think that's why it's important for us to also take responsibility for our parts of the cycle. It's an automatic reaction to want to um, have the other person take responsibility first, or to even be focused on what the other person is doing. And it may seem counterintuitive, but it's important if we're going to change the cycle for us to be able to talk about what we see ourselves doing. And maybe even more importantly, to take responsibility for what we're feeling. And it's okay at first to be talking about just like our initial feeling, our initial reaction. But after we've been able to share what our initial reaction is to dig a little deeper and talk about what's underneath that thought or what's underneath that emotion. Like for example, my original emotion might be to be angry, to be frustrated, just to be sad. But underneath that may be a deeper thought or a deeper feeling, like feeling inadequate or not good enough or being blamed, feeling like those are the things that may be the underlying feeling which is causing or leading to frustration or to anger. And what is often fueling the feeling is what our unmet attachment needs might be. And being able to think about and take responsibility, not to blame other people for those needs not being met, which is, again, a natural tendency, is to want those needs to be fulfilled outside of ourselves. Instead of that, having an internal locus of control and being able to own those needs on for ourselves without projecting it to someone else to fix for us.
Yeah, and it's interesting that if you're willing to say I'm sorry, so much more can happen in any kind of relationship. And it doesn't, get in. Sometimes you get into a cycle where all you're saying is I'm sorry, and the other person isn't even hearing that. So that's not terribly helpful. But be able to actually take responsibility and say, I see that I'm responsible for part of what's going on here in this cycle, and I want to step out of that. I want to make amends by stepping out of that and allowing us to look at it in a different way and experience this in a different way. But it is interesting that so often we expect people to sort of be mind readers, to be able to figure out what you need without actually asking for what you need. And sometimes that's what you might be apologizing for, is I'm sorry that I expected you to read my mind and be able to fill my needs without me telling you what those needs were. And so you can step into personal responsibility, trying to make the relationship mutually beneficial so that both of you are getting your needs met.
I see it as being directly related to unmet needs. And it's fine if you have your own words as you're describing to the person you're working with what your unmet needs are. But I imagine as you do, you find that they all fit within one of those four categories. That a lot of times when we're reactive, it's because we don't feel like we've been seen, that we don't, whether it's been listened to, understood, valued for what we've done, what we've contributed, and how invested we are. Then to feel safe, the ability to not hold back. In fact, I think it's when we don't feel safe that we often our reaches are blaming and looking at the other person to fix them for us. And when we feel safe, the more likely we are to be able to naturally take responsibility for that ourselves. And when we do that, oddly enough, the person can usually respond in a way that will increase that sense of safety. And then to be able to feel soothed, life is hard. And when life gets hard, we want to turn to those that we love most to get the comfort. And also, when those we love most are hurting, we want to be able to provide to them that comfort. And that's the soothing. And the last part is secure. When we can have a difficult conversation, we can disagree with each other, and we can walk away from that conversation without feeling threatened, like their commitment or our questioning of the quality of the relationship is lessened because of it. We can walk away feeling secure.
All right. So the next one is to change the goal. And I think when we what we're trying to do is just see this whole thing in a little different way. And it does require mindfulness, not necessarily the kind of mindfulness to well, it always requires the kind of mindfulness where you can stay in the present and where you can ground yourself to the present and be able to, operate from a mindfulness place. But it's also intentionality. You've got to look at, what you can change any of these pieces. If you change any piece, you're going to change the whole cycle. And so changing the behavior will change the process. And changing, and it's harder to change the process unless you are changing the behavior. So you need to be able to put those pieces together in order to be able to make something different. So starting out in a relationship, in any kind of a discussion with the person that you really care about, is to have a goal in mind and use mindfulness to get there and change what you need to change in order to change the whole cycle.
What I found with this one too is that most people, especially when they're arguing with someone, their goal is to win.
Right.
Their goal is to change the other person's mind. And what I think of when I see change the goal is that when you're having an argument or a conversation, is to first seek to understand the other person before you seek to be understood.
Right.
And that's changing the goal. Instead of trying to win, try to understand. I remember I think it was Dr. Jim Thomas in our trainings talked about being curious. What if curiosity was your goal instead of trying to, get them to do what you wanted? Just to help me really truly understand this. Dr. Scott Sales talks about the Columbo approach that just like, well, anything else? What else? And just ask a bunch of questions that show that you're really trying to understand exactly where they're coming from.
Yeah, instead of trying to convince them that you're right.
Yeah.
But we do get pretty stuck on being right a lot of times in these cycles.
Well, I think one of the things that's hard because when we have the unmet need to be seen or feel safe, like I think that's where it comes out, is trying to be right, because there's either one person who wants to be right, but what they're really wanting to be is seen.
Yes.
And usually the other person is the one that starts withdrawing and disengaging and pulling back. But I think usually their unmet need is just feeling safe.
And it seems like the fear is that if you allow the person to help you see them, if you ask questions to understand and to seek to understand, sometimes the fear is that means you're agreeing with perhaps things that they're choosing to do that are dangerous to them or can be dangerous to them. And so a lot of times I think what we find when you're talking with your child or daughter who maybe has a substance abuse issue is that when you feel like you're asking questions to understand, that you're somehow implicitly agreeing with their addiction. And you're not necessarily agreeing with the behavior that's dangerous or difficult. It's the understanding why and what's going on and just understanding them better, allowing them to be seen. And so I think you have to sort of separate those two things in your brain, that asking more questions and trying to understand doesn't mean that you're agreeing with their addiction, that they should continue their addiction. Mm-hmm. So we can separate those.
Let's move on to the R.
Okay, so R, we mentioned that briefly last week, and it's the kind of the attitude of being able to be in a healthy relationship. Go ahead and go to the next screen because it kind of breaks these down, Troy. So it's how we interact with each other, and I think this particular slide. These next two slides are from Sue Johnson, and they're designed specifically for couples. And the examples she uses is a couple. But I think it applies very easily to working with your son or daughter. And it mentions that we have all these ways of communicating, but we seem to be actually communicating less. That the telephones and texting seem to disconnect us from each other rather than connect us from each other. She gives an example here about the fact that a wife is saying that she's not able to get her husband's attention because he's always texting. but it shows that they're basically in a room together, and maybe even engaging in the same activity, but they're not actually connecting with each other. And so when it talks about accessibility, it's, can I reach you? Can you hear me? And can I be heard? And am I able to hear you as well? And so accessibility is basically putting down the cell phones and getting a chance to be able to really connect with each other and not be distracted. It's interesting to me, one of the things that I always makes me laugh is that, if you were standing on the sidewalk talking to someone directly, no one would walk up to you and stand in between you and start talking to you. But that's what the phones do. And it seems like we have this obligation, if the phone goes off, whether it's a text or a call, that we have to immediately respond to it, even if we're in the middle of a conversation with someone. And it seems like we need to step back and say, wait a second, if this was a human, not my cell phone, would I be interrupting this conversation? And so that's part of the accessibility, is being able to put cell phones down, but at the same time being really truly accessible to each other and paying attention to each other.
And I think in our heart, we know when someone is paying attention to us and when they're not.
Yeah, it's easily we can tell. There's no such thing as multitasking. We're just doing one thing at a time and trying to do a bunch of them in
I
sequence quickly.
keep on telling my son that when he's doing homework, doing school online now,
Yeah,
and he's doing homework on one screen and he's watching a YouTube video on the other.
yeah. There's not a lot happening in there.
Yeah.
Then stands for responsiveness. Responsiveness is about being able to rely on your partner or the person that you're interacting with to interact with you on an emotional level in both good and bad situations. Whether it's that you have something bad goes wrong and they're there to support you and soothe you, or if it's good news that they're willing to celebrate with you. Neurologically, this level of connection and ability to respond is very calming to the nervous system. It's actually biologically part of the way that we operate. And so having someone be responsive to you, whether it's good times or bad times, you have a physiological response to that. And it becomes very reassuring. And you get the message that you're not alone in the world and that you're being taken care of, and you can relax and let your guard down.
I also find that it's not just being responsive to like what they're saying, which it is that too, but responsive to what their needs are. And I think this is where like the person who's usually the pursuer goes like, well, I'm the one who's always being responsive. It's the withdrawing partner that's not engaging, but it's not, they're pursuing with a lot of criticisms or complaining, and they're not being really responsive to what the real need is, which is maybe for them to feel safe and being able to be responsive to that need first. Again, trying to like not get stuck on the content of the conversation, but what is the process that each person is going through. But it's also true for the partner who is withdrawing that they do need to be responsive. And they may seem like the most unnatural thing for them to do, but to be able to respond to what the other person is saying, even if it does sound like a complaint or a criticism, hearing what their real need is. Like maybe they too need to feel like if these things aren't done, I don't feel safe, or I don't feel like things are being seen. Please engage with me.
And that is the last one, is engagement of the ARE. And it's just an act, initials to help us remember these three things. Engagement is just, for a romantic couple, it's all those yummy feelings of knowing that your partner is attracted to you, values you, is absorbed by you, and wants to be involved with you. But in any other relationship, it's those feelings of the same thing, that the person wants to be around you, that they value you, that they want to be connected and with you. It gives the message that you're valued and that you matter. And it's really difficult, I think. Let me finish this last part. Having somebody engage with you this way is very calming again to the nervous system, and knowing that you have someone by your side who's looking out for you means that on a biological level you're not alone for your fight, or having to fight for your own survival. It allows more primitive neurological wiring to relax. But it's a difficult thing for parents, because You want to maintain those relationships with your adult children, but at the same time, they're in the process of individuation. And so there's part of them that it becomes a really awkward and messy process of letting go and holding on and letting go and holding on and trying to change the way that the relationship is so that you're two adults having a relationship and wanting to be with each other, but they're not just there to be, coddled or taken care of as a child. At the same time, it's really nice to know that they're not alone, that they have you on their side, that they'll be there for you and be able to help you out depending on what struggles you might have. And so it's a tricky balance to be able to keep those boundaries, letting them moving toward adulthood, and yet being a supportive and still wanting to have that relationship in that process of change from being a child parent relationship to a child adult child relationship, parent relationship.
Yeah, I want to move somewhat into the book, The Anatomy of Peace. And Maddy, as you've been talking, there's been a couple of times where I've wanted to jump forward to this.
Okay, go for it.
Because I feel like that these things, like, they relate.
Yes.
So they merge really well. And the idea behind the anatomy of peace is that whatever we do, any behavior, can be done in at least one of two ways. And it has more to do with what's underneath, or the intention behind what we've said or behind what we've done, than it is the content of what we've actually done. And either our heart's at peace or our heart's at war. And this is a lot like what we've talked about earlier, that when we're in this cycle with other people, one of the ways that we get stuck in the cycle, and this is about changing the goal again, is that we can only see ourselves. We can't see the other person. So it's about me, not the other. And in many ways, that's like having a heart at peace, is when I can see the other person, or it's like having an outward mindset. It's having a we mindset, an us mindset. When we have a heart at war, and that usually looks like us having a me or a mine or an I perspective. And that's one of those things that keeps us locked in the cycle, when both me and my partner, whether it's my son, my daughter, my spouse, both of us or all of us have an I perspective, then all we're doing is talking about this from our own place. And we will keep doing the same thing that we always do. And there's a litmus test that the Arbinger Institute offers to us. And I don't think it's actually here on this chart, but when we have a heart at war, that we objectify the other person. And it's not a natural state, by the way. We don't naturally objectify people at the beginning. We do eventually naturally do that. But we can tell if we've gotten into that place because of three things. The first is that we see the other person as a problem or as an obstacle. The second is we see them as a tool or a vehicle, something that we can use to help us get what we want. Or three, they're neither of the first two, so they are now irrelevant. And we treat them as being irrelevant in our lives. And we all, again, it's an intuitive nature, and we also tend to mirror it. It's a mirror neuron thing. So if others are projecting this towards us, we will probably put it back towards them. I think we'll talk about that in a minute. But we are, we naturally can tell when that's happening, when someone sees us as a problem, when someone's just trying to use us, and especially hurtful when people think we're irrelevant or not important. Now, the other side of that is having a heart at peace. And when we have a heart at peace, we actually see other people as equal to us. Whatever their needs are, their feelings are, their hurts, their pains, all the things that they are going through are as important to us as our own. It doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice or give up our own or acquiesce to them or placate them or even change their behavior, our behavior towards them. But it means that our heart and our intentions are focused on their needs as much as anyone else's. I've had an experience the other day. We drive over the mountains here to get anywhere, and I was driving over the pass here, and there's a popular lake called Fish Lake, and I was passing the Fish Lake Pass, and as I got up on it, this car pulled out in front of me, and I just naturally looked in my rearview mirror, and there wasn't a car in sight behind me. And at first, I thought, "What on earth? Why couldn't you just waited for me? There's no one behind me. Why are you making me slow down?" And I had this thought come to me of, well, you know what? I don't know why, but they have as much of a right to be on this road as I do. And it was interesting just how quickly just having that thought changed my perspective. At first, I was irritated, maybe even a little mad, but my heart changed, and it didn't affect me anymore. I wasn't feeling those feelings. It passed as soon as I realized that that person has as much right as I do.
That's a good example. I think about the story in the Anatomy of Peace of what was his name? Malachi. Can you remember his name? Anyway,
You're going to pronounce it better than I will.
well, I don't know. He was a Jewish beggar, basically on the Arab side of the border. And he was the young man who's telling the story in the book. Saw him. He's blind. He's walking down the sidewalk, and he tripped and fell, and all of the coins that he had collected all day just scattered out across the sidewalk. And his first impulse, his first sense that he had inside was, oh my gosh, there's a blind guy, and he just dropped all of the money that he received from begging all day, and that's what he's going to need to buy his bread. And the first impulse was to get down on his hands and knees and help him gather those coins back up. But then he thought, wait a second, he's a Jew and he shouldn't be here. And my grandfather was killed by Jews, and Jews are not good, and they're terrible, and they shouldn't exist. And he immediately went from a heart at peace, where he had a sense to help this person. And instead of honoring that sense, he betrayed that sense and went to a heart at war and thought about what people had told him about Jewish people, and that he shouldn't like them and he shouldn't help them. And so I think our natural tendencies, a lot of times, are to do the right thing. And they talk about in the book about honoring the sense, and the sense of doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And that we get ourselves into a heart at war when we betray that initial idea of helping people and seeing people as people and not as objects.
And I mentioned before too, this is yours, but I just wanted to say, like, that when we do this chronically, like we've given into that, we've dishonored the sense for long enough, we tend to fall into these boxes.
Yeah, and they only come up with 4 boxes. I think I have more than that personally, but they try to categorize 4 different ways that we get stuck in ways of seeing people as objects instead of as people. And they are, that we talk about in the Anatomy of Peace, is the better than box, which is your view of yourself is that you're superior and important and right, and that other people are inferior or incapable, that your feelings are, disdainful or indifferent, and your view of the world tends to be very competitive, and that you're again seeing people as objects and seeing them as a lot of times obstacles or vehicles. Or we end up in the I deserve box. And the thing is we all deserve to be treated and to be respected, but this is a different kind of deserve. This is the view of myself is that I am unappreciated, that I'm mistreated or a victim. My view of others is that they're mistaken or mistreating of me and ungrateful. My feelings tend to be entitled, that I deserve to have this, resentful. And the view of the world is that it's unjust and that the world owes me something.
Where our view of ourselves, and this is and I think again, this is where both models, whether it's the Anatomy of Peace or the EFT approach, the attachment approach, are so overlapping. Because and I think it's a little bit less pathologizing to some extent, in that we talk about it as being an unmet attachment need, and not necessarily like this moral judgment of us being in the box or out of the box. Not that that was anyone's intention, I don't think. But when we have an unmet need of not being seen, I think that really fuels this idea of being a must be seen as box. Our view of others, when we feel like, especially when they're not seeing all the things that we're doing, that we feel other people are are judgmental, that they're threatening, that the world is dangerous, that they're always judging me, like I can never do anything right, and I'm always anxious. Like, this is where we talk about hyperarousal, like an emotional sunburn, where we're just ready for people to hurt our feelings, take advantage of us. So we walk around feeling anxious and afraid, overwhelmed, stressed out, and people probably perceive that as being needy. And the view of myself is that I need to project to the world what I want them to see of me. Like I'm afraid of them seeing anything but that. Like someone who, like, they can't handle anything that might even be conflictual at all. Like, they just have to be like positive about everything, and they can't. They'll, to the point of not being able to see like what's really going on. They have a distorted view because they just have to be seen as always doing everything right, as everything's got to be going just fine. Um, Everything has to be seen as being perfect. So we get in the must be seen as, and then the worst end box, which I think is maybe what happens when we finally give up. I can't maintain this anymore. I give up, and no one else in the world has this worse than me. And it's like becoming a martyr, where like on steroids, the view of others is that everyone else is privileged, everyone else is blessed, everyone else is advantaged. The world is hard and it's against me, and I'm irrelevant to the world. I feel helpless. I feel jealous about everything. I'm depressed, and that I'm just seen as broken.
Yeah. And what we'd like to do here is we'd like to have you, if you haven't read The Anatomy of Peace, please read it, because there's a lot of good principles, a lot of good examples that they give in that book. And we might want to just end the session here for today and have you give in with an invitation that you just notice and pay attention to where you find yourself in these boxes, possibly during the week, and also finding if you're finding yourself with a heart at peace or a heart at war, and what that's doing to your cycle process, so that you begin to apply the anatomy of peace, specifically those principles that we're talking about, to the negative cycles that happen in our families. And we're about out of time, so we're going to probably wrap things up here, and we'll start at this point next week, refreshing these boxes and maybe having you give us some examples about where you might have found yourself in one of those boxes during the week, and then moving on from there with the rest of the stuff we want to talk about for the anatomy of peace. How's that sound, Troy?
Yeah. Everyone have a great week. Stay safe. Stay home.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. See ya.
Thank you.